Matthew chapter 16, verse 24 reads like this. Jesus said unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Tonight, just want to ponder with you. Would that you would think about this, the flow of denial. The flow of denial. Now, in a traditional sense and in a literal sense, we all realize that there is a river in Africa by the name of the Nile. It is Denial River. Yes, and Denial River is a distinct river. It's an unusual river because in the northern hemisphere, it flows from south to north. It's estimated to have a distance or a length of 4,150 miles, 4,150. No one can really point to its origin, but what makes the Nile distinct is that it flows from south to north in the northern hemisphere. If anyone knows about rivers, you'll realize that rivers tend to flow in the northern hemisphere from north to south. And in the southern hemisphere, they would flow from south to north. That is because physically, rivers flow based on the fact that the globe is spinning. I didn't do that well in science class, but I did a little research before I got here and found out that the rivers, the centrifugal force of the Earth's rotation drives rivers typically to flow from north to south in the northern hemisphere and from south to north in the southern hemisphere. However, the Nile found in the northern hemisphere flows from south to north. And the reason for that is because like there are several other unique rivers like this that flow from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. And the point that I'm trying to raise is that denial always flows from the top to the bottom. Denial always flows from the top to the bottom. Whatever the mindset of leadership is, will be reflected in fellowship. Whatever the mindset of those designated for vision and those designated for direction will be reflected in those who must then follow those said directions. Wherever there is an accusation, you'll find that there's a denial. Denial is interesting because the truth of the matter is those that have the benefit of privilege and access to critical resources must learn then, as our Savior teaches, to deny self. If there will ever be any truth or veracity or sense of authenticity or power to our efforts to represent Christ, we've got to learn, as the word teaches us tonight in verse 24 of Matthew 16, to deny self. Now, we've got to first start with a baseline understanding of what self is. Self is a person's essential being that distinguishes them from others, especially considered as the object of introspection or reflexive action. Myself is the way that I see myself as distinct from others. Yes, especially when I consider myself as the object of introspection. I'm looking inward or reflexive action as a result of what I've seen when I looked within. There's a distinction between me, I, and myself. And Christ is calling us to deny self, self in terms of one's thoughts toward their own personhood or status as relative to and distinct from others. And denial has a flow. So if we are to deny self, then we've got to deny self from the top on down. Deny self in terms of what? 3 points I'll throw at you real quick and I'll move on. Denial of self in terms of sacrifice. What are we willing to give up? When we have lofty ideals of making things better for other folks. The truth of the matter is, if that will happen effectively, it will involve some sense of sacrifice. And sacrifice is not sacrifice if what you're giving up doesn't mean anything to you. We have a little saying at Rivermont Baptist Church, where I'm blessed to serve as pastor, that you've got to give until you feel it. It's not giving unless you feel it. There's a difference between just giving something away and then sacrificing something that has value to you. What are we willing to give up? The second area of self-denial that I'll point to tonight is in terms of service. Which is a little different from sacrifice. When we engage in service, especially toward one another, toward our human brothers and sisters, it's important that we realize also, similar to sacrifice, service entails some form of discomfort. It's one thing to do something that I do every single day with my eyes closed and then hope that someone benefits from it. But what have I gone out of my way to do in order to benefit someone other than myself or my chosen or professed group? You'll hear the word encourage us to not be weary in well-doing, because in due season we will reap. So there is some value to self-denial in terms of sacrifice, self-denial in terms of service. But finally, I want to just point to the fact that if we are truly to deny self, we've got to see that self-denial in terms of solidarity. Yes, solidarity is the ultimate form of self-denial that you and I can come up with, because it is a greater priority for me to see to it that we are all doing well, rather than to see to my own distinct needs, my own distinct preferences. Solidarity entails, yes, me putting my agenda, my personal agenda, a little bit to the side, so that we can see that the agenda of humanity, so that we can see that the purpose that Christ has empowered us to is accomplished. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sins, and I'll heal the land. You'll hear Christ say in another place in Matthew that, yes, at a certain point, you'll understand that I have sheep that are not from this fold. I have sheep in my flock that are not from this fold. Yeah, and the thing about it, he says that one day they will have one shepherd, and yes, and they will see themselves as one fold. Together, brothers and sisters, we must follow Christ. As I close, I just want to share with you that in high school, math was one of my favorite subjects. However, I did not do well in that section about fractions. Fractions gave me problems. Fractions gave me real problems. Fractions gave me problems, and I think I understand why now as a grown-up. Fractions gave me problems because they don't come together easily. Yeah, it's hard to work with fractions. They don't come together so easily. You're trying to figure out how you're going to make one half come together with 1/3, and some of us just sit there and scratch our heads. I don't care if it's addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division. It doesn't really matter. It's just not easy to work with fractions. And if you look at the world as we see it, on my way to my seat, I just want to call attention to the fractions that we have in our families. We have fractions in our homes. We have fractions in our communities. We have fractions in our churches. We have fractions in our government, fractions in our schools, fractions even in our faith community. When I asked for a little bit of help with working with fractions, my math teacher gave me 2 points of advice. He said, you're not going to get anywhere until you learn how to deal with fractions. Oh my goodness. You mean I'm not going to be able to get beyond this point until I learn how to deal with fractions? Then he went a little further and he gave me some insight that has helped me. I'll share it with you and I'll get out of your way. Every fraction desires to be whole. Every fraction, yes, desires to be whole. So how are we going to cause these fractions in our lives to be whole? Well, what I learned as I looked through the textbook was that a fraction can only be manipulated when we find the common denominator. When we find the common denominator to our fractions, then we can take our broken pieces and bring them together and be whole as the people of God. The one thing I want to leave you with is the fact that every whole number has a common denominator. Every whole number has a common denominator. You may be trying to figure out, what does a 3 have to do with an 11? Or what does a 4 have to do with a 13? The truth of the matter is, when you take that individual number and set it on top of the 1, there it is. When you set it on top of the 1, then they have something in common. They can come together. They can be multiplied, added. They can be dealt with. And you remember our Savior in Gethsemane with the ultimate example of self-denial. He said, Father, if it be possible, remove this cup from me. I don't want to do it. My flesh is feeling this thing. But nevertheless, not my will be done. Fractions come together when we place them on the 1. Which one? The one that died for us, the one that forgave, the one that saw to the needs of his mother and others right from the cross he was suffering on. The one who put his spirit into God's hands, the one who ultimately gave up the ghost, the one who rose on the 3rd day with all power in his hand. Now the question is, are you willing to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow Jesus?